Today, Maisey Harris is going to teach you how to get real-time and historical data using the Analytics API for Genesys Cloud. So without further ado, Maisey, you want to take it away?
Sure. Okay, so hey everyone, I am Maisey Harris. I am a member of the Genesys Cloud development team. I'm the development group manager for reporting and analytics UI. I've been doing it for about 6 years, so since the start of Genesys Cloud. So let's dive right in. There are 3 different perspectives of data that we typically explore with the Analytics API. Those are Instantaneous Observations, Aggregate Metrics, and Detail Records. So let's start with those Instantaneous Observations, which are the metrics that are only pertinent right now. They don't have a time interval, there's no lagging indicators such as averages, and there's no coarser view of the world. And just to jump in real quick and clarify, this is the bulk of the real-time component of your analytics data. So we're going to discuss real-time and historical, and I'll try to point out at what point we're touching on those areas, but this will be all real-time data. Simply a snapshot of what is happening right now. These observation metrics are more likely to serve you in building real-time applications, things like dashboards. They're not going to be useful for historical reporting or general data ingestion since the data is not interval-based. And so this data is what you see if you look at, for example, the queue activity views in PureCloud. These are one of the more common examples of that. So we can see how many phone calls are waiting in a queue, how many agents are available to take interactions, things like that. There are currently 3 observation endpoints. Those are queues, flows, and users. So let's start with the queues because those are the primary ones you're going to look at. I'm going to show you how to make these API calls and also explain a bit about the response so you know how to interpret the data. And in this case, I'm using Postman to make my queries, but I'll show you a little later on how you can use a tool in the Development Center to make these requests. So let's go over to Postman. So my endpoint I'm going to be hitting is queues observations query, and I'm going to be doing a post. I'm going to have to supply a body in that request, and let's talk a little bit about what is here. So the filter is going to filter my observation data to one of these 3 queues. So I'm providing each of these predicates and I'm ORing them, which means I want data for any of them, any of these 3 queues. And because this is a queue-specific endpoint, I'm going to have an implicit group by for queues, so I don't need to group by them separately. We've also added detail metrics, and you can do O-waiting or O-interacting, or both. And what those are going to do is they're going to tell you some actual detailed data about what is waiting and what is interacting. So for an example of what you might use this for, longest waiting interaction. So let me know right now what is the longest waiting call in my queue, and let me see the skills and all the details around it so I can figure out why it's been waiting so long. So I'm going to make this request, and I'm just going to pull this data over here so we can look at it. So to start with, we have a system to organization mapping. And what that is that's going to tell us for any of the IDs we might see further down around presences, we can know which system presence they correspond to. So in this case, there's only 1 for each of these. But if you do utilize secondary statuses, you'll have that data broken down. And this way you can roll it up to know what your system level metrics are. For our results, we first have a grouping for a QID. This is not specific to any media type. These are going to be only your presence metrics. So we've got a few different metrics here we can explore. O active users is the number of users joined to that queue. O member users are the actual members. So there are 4 that are members but are inactive right now and won't take interactions. And then we have our presence and routing status data. So we generally look at user routing statuses, which is our metric, and then we have a qualifier for each of our routing statuses. So our routing statuses are off queue, interacting, communicating, idle, not responding. So we can see in this given moment how many people are in a given routing status. So for example, I have 7 idle agents right now, 7 agents who are on queue but are not actually taking an interaction right now. I can also look at the user presences metric. And so this has the qualifier of the IDs that I mentioned above. So I can see that this one is offline. So I have 9 offline users. So I'll have a different grouping for each of my queues because this is a queues observations endpoint. We're going to see the presence data for each of these queues. And it's also important to remember that this is specific to your queues, but you can't really roll them up because an agent could be on multiple queues. So we really need to consider these presence metrics separately because I could be interacting on 2 queues and we don't want you to double count by adding them together. We then get into groupings for media type. So media type is also an implicit group by, and that's because most of the time you don't want to be comparing your chat stats and your call stats like they're the same thing because they're not. So for this example, I've got media type as chat. I can see I don't have any interactions, so no chats going on right now. And I can see that I have 9 waiting chats. And this is where we get to the detail metrics that I mentioned. We've got an observations list, and we've also got this truncated flag that goes with that. And what that means is that right now the observations list is giving me up to the top 50 and bottom 50 interactions. So the 50 oldest and the 50 newest. So if I don't have a gap and this is showing me every interaction, then truncated is false. But if you have 200 interactions waiting, truncated it is going to be true because there's going to be a gap of data that you're just not going to be getting here. So let's look at an observation. So we have an observation date, and in that case, it's not the conversation time. It's the time that the interaction actually went into this queue. So that you can know how long it has been waiting. You also have your conversation ID, just needed for linking, your session ID as well. You're going to have a participant name, so a way to identify the participant when possible. Any information around routing. If you had skills, that would also appear here so that you may have an interaction waiting in your queue that you just you don't have any agents skilled to handle, so that's why they're waiting. And then also just the direction. So this information is meant to give you some of the basics that you would need to manage your queue if there are changes that you need to make. And so we're gonna have, for any media type where there is data in any queue, we're gonna have a grouping. So this is the same thing, just with a different media type, that's voice. And we can see some differences. So this is interacting. I've got 48 interacting voice interactions right now. And now I can actually see the user ID because it is interacting. I can tell which agent is picking it up. I can also see Annie and Dinas in the case that because this is a voice session. So for each media type, there's going to be some different data based on what you are going to be able to get out of it. So then let's go back here. You can change any of these things. You could, if you have a small enough number of queues, you don't have to supply a QID filter. You can remove these detail metrics entirely. If you don't need them, don't bother requesting them. It's generally a good idea to only request the data that you need. So I mentioned that in addition to queue observations, there are flow observations and user observations. And I'm not going to run through queries of those right now, just because we have a lot to get to. But here I am in the Dev Center, and we can see our API resources for analytics. And we can look at our flow observations endpoint. This is a really simple endpoint. You provide a flow ID instead of a queue ID for it in your filters. And what it's going to give you is O active flow, or O flow, sorry. And that's going to be the number of interactions in a given flow at that period of time. We also have user observations, which generally, again, are not used quite as much. And this is going to give you O active queues and O member queues. So similarly to how queue observations told us how many member users and how many active users we had, this is going to tell me that Jane Doe is active on 2 queues right now, but she's the member of 5 queues, for example. So that's what you would use the user observations endpoint for. Let's move over to our aggregate metrics. And these aggregate metrics are generally the KPIs that you care about to measure the performance of your center over some time interval. The data is typically partitioned into smaller time buckets. And there are several aggregate metric endpoints you can use. Again, the API docs are going to be a really great resource for that, but we'll go through conversations and users specifically. You can also do evaluations, flows, surveys. Anytime we add a new type of data, we try to give you the aggregate endpoint so that you can get all of that data back out. So conversation aggregates are metrics around the interaction. Throughout an interaction, we track each event. So for a conversation, we can determine the handle time, the average speed of answer, total hold, and many other details. And a key concept with aggregates that is important to understand before diving in is that each metric is emitted at a specific time in the conversation. So when a conversation is offered into the queue, inoffered is emitted with a timestamp. And when a conversation is wrapped up, TACW is emitted with that timestamp. So conversations data may span multiple time buckets depending on your granularity. That also means that you need to be careful not to assume that for a given interval, which is generally 30 minutes, that the data may always add up. The data is going to always be accurate, but you may have to expand into other intervals to see all of that data. So let's try a conversation aggregates query request for voice interactions and a queue. So I'm going to switch over to doing a post to the conversation aggregates query endpoint. And I've got one queued up here. And so we start with that filter again, just like in the observations. I'm still supplying those QIDs. I'm still saying any of them. Give me any of those. But I also have this additional predicate, media type voice. And this isn't necessary, but it is going to filter out to only give us voice data. So what I'm saying is I care about any data where the media type is voice and one of these QIDs is present. I'm going to group by QID, and that's because this is not a queue-specific endpoint since it is conversations. So I'm going to have to group by QID if I want to see my data broken down by queue. And then I'm going to supply a list of metrics. This is a list of metrics that you would use in the queue performance views, for example. And then something that the observations endpoint didn't have is the interval. So I have to supply an interval of data that I care about. So in this case, I'm looking for all voice data for my 3 queues for the month of February. So let's go ahead and execute that. We'll take that data and go look at it. So the data looks fairly similar. We don't have our system to organizational presence mapping, but we do have our groupings based on QID. And again, that media type is an implicit group by. We don't have to ask for it. It's always going to be there. But when I look at my results, I now have data with an interval. So in this case, my interval of February. and I'm going to see my metric. So this is going to be any metric that appeared. So I requested a certain number of metrics. Anything I didn't request isn't going to come. And if I requested a metric and there's just no data, it's also not going to come back. So you can see we've got a variety of metrics here, and I'll just walk through a few of them. We've got our in offered, so that's the number of interactions that were offered to the queue for the month of February, and we've got a count. So that's the only stat that you're going to get for the offered metric. But if we move over to a time-based metric, so a metric that starts with a T, we're going to have 4 different values. So we have our sum, so that's going to tell me, in this case, total abandoned time, and this is in milliseconds. The count is going to tell me the number of times an abandon actually happened, and I can use the sum over the count to determine the average. So we could determine the average time it takes for an abandon interaction. We can also get the minimum. So in this case, the smallest amount of time that an interaction abandoned, and so in this case, about 5 seconds. And then also the max. So what was the biggest abandoned time that we had? So we've got our after call work time, our T answered, we would use the sum over the count to get our average speed of answer for a queue. We've got handle, a variety of metrics. We also have our service level data. So we have our O service target. We can know that our current target is 85%. But we can also see in our O service level metric, the ratio is going to be our actual service level. But if you want to get that yourself, you can also just do the numerator divided by the denominator. So that's going to give you your actual service level. And then also we have our target again there. And we're going to have groupings based on each media type and queue ID, because that's what we requested with our group by. So you're going to see a variety of data there. But what if I want to break down this data into days? So I don't want the view of the entire month. I want to know how every day compared. Well, I can go back to my requests, and I can add a granularity. So this is going to be the amount of time in each time bucket. And there's a variety of options you can do. Generally, we'll do a P1D for 1 day. But you can do really anything. It is important to know that if you request too many buckets of time, Analytics will give you a response that you need to alter your query. So for example, if I said I want the month by every minute, then Analytics is going to tell me that granularity is too fine. We're not going to give you that much data back. But let me change it back to P1D, and that means 1 day buckets. So I'm going to now get 1 day buckets of time, and I'm only going to get data or days where I actually had data. So again, I've got those same group bys. Nothing's different there. But now my interval, in this case, is February 1st to the start of February 2nd. So 1 day, the first day of February. And I'm going to have metrics just for that day. I'm going to go down. Now I've got February 2nd's data. And we're going to just keep going down. And this is going to give you what you need to be able to do a historical comparison. You could do break down a day by 30-minute intervals. You could break down a year by months. You can do all sorts of things so that you can kind of see some trends and things like that. And again, if we have a day where there isn't data, we would just be skipping over that. There would be no interval for that. So if there's no data that comes back for a given interval, it means that nothing happened in that queue that day. But what if I don't want data just for my queue, but I also want to know if we're properly staffed with the right skills and languages to meet demand? So that would be more like the skills performance view. And I can just show you that really quickly. So this view shows you the skills and language combinations broken down by queue. So we want to try to get that data. I'm going to hit that same conversation aggregates query endpoint, but I'm going to have a few differences. So I have this flat and multi-value dimensions flag. And right now I'm setting it to true, and I'll show you what that will do if I change it to false. By default, it is false. But we'll talk about that more when we look at the response. Group by, instead of just our QID, we also have requested routing skill ID and requested language ID. I've also only requested the metrics I care about, because I don't need to ask for data that I'm not going to actually use. I've got my interval again, in this case the month of February, and my only filter this time is for the voice media type. I'm only looking at my voice data right now. So this flat and multi-valued dimensions is going to help me know the difference between a skill having data and a group of skills having data. So just briefly, let's look here. We've got requested routing skill ID, and you can see that this is 2 IDs. And that means that in this case, that data is related to that group of skills. So 2 skills together on an interaction. If I change it to false, I'm going to see that data for each separate skill. And the issue with that for this level of reporting is that it's going to result in you not getting a full picture. It's important to know that skill A and skill B were both required for an interaction, rather than knowing skill A separate from skill B. So I want to, in this case, set that again to true. And let's look at that data. Okay, so we again have our results with our group, and in this case, we have that media type group. We have our QID because we asked for that, and if we have our requested routing skill ID again with possibly flattened values, so 2 skills here. And if we had languages, we would also have languages there. And then I don't have a granularity, so I'm getting 1 time bucket again for all of February, and I'm going to have only the metrics I requested. So I can see that for these 2 skills in this queue for the month, I had a service level of 100%. So we're doing fine on that skill. But if you had another interaction where you weren't doing quite so well, in this case, our service level is 50%. We might need to see why that is. And so when you get these IDs, you are going to have to hit other endpoints to get that information. So the API resources are going to give you what you need there. So in this case, if I want to get the skill name, I'm going to go to routing. You can also search. And then there's these routing skills endpoints. So I can take one of the skill IDs and throw it in this request. And this time I'm doing a get to routing skills in the skill ID. And in this case, my skill name is gold. So that's your way of taking the IDs and turning them into readable data, unless you have all of your skill IDs memorized. So I encourage you to play with that endpoint and explore the different dimensions. There are all sorts of different things you can look at here. You can read through the different metrics you have possible here. Again, there's a lot of them. And then also look through your dimensions. Again, there are a lot of things that you can group by, a lot of different views of the world that you can have. Please remember that the cardinality of your dimensions does matter too when doing a group by. So for example, grouping by direction is low cardinality because there are only 2 options, inbound and outbound. But if you group by conversation ID, which is high cardinality because it is unique to every conversation, you may run into limits. So analytics will restrict you at 50,000 groups, which is going to be really easy to get to when you are doing a query for high cardinality groupings, especially if you are looking at a large interval. So before we move on to the next type of aggregates, I want to touch on a really powerful part of these queries, user-defined views. The request starts very similar, but we're going to have an additional list of views here. So I'm giving an array, and what this is going to do is it's going to tell me for a time metric, again, something that starts with T, we can determine how many times the value was between a certain number of milliseconds. For example, I can query on T-abandon and determine how many times the abandon happened in that first 6 seconds, or how many times did it happen after 2 minutes, or anywhere in between. So we can name the metric whatever we want. In this case, I've named it T-abandon threshold 1. It's my first abandon threshold. And I can do that for however many I want. And when I get my data back, I'm actually going to see these metric names. So let's execute that query. So I have this data. It looks the same. I've got my groupings, my interval data, but now I have views, and I can see T-abandon threshold 1, that name I came up with. I had 1. So I had 1 abandon in that first threshold of 0 to 6 seconds. And I can just go through and see I had 173 abandons, but now I get to see how they broke down. So 118 happened in my last threshold, which was basically everything after 2 minutes. So we can do that for any of these metrics and get a little bit more insight into your data. So you can see if people are abandoning because they hear that they're going to be waiting in queue and they immediately hang up, or you can see that, well, we're making them wait for a really long time. Maybe that's why they are actually leaving. So now let's explore user aggregates, which are based on status data. With this data, we can figure out how each user spent time in each status. So we're going to switch over to Analytics Users Aggregates query, and we're going to do a post again. We're going to supply an interval just the same. We're going to filter for the users we care about. You don't have to, but if you have a lot of users, it may be a lot of data to process, and generally we find that there's a subset of users that we care about. And we can supply metrics again. In this case, T system presence and T agent routing status. And I'll execute that and then we'll discuss what that means. So again, in our results, we have that system to organizational mappings, and that's going to come into play here again because we're looking at status data. If you only have your system statuses, it's not going to be as much of an issue, but if you do have secondary statuses, you're going to want to rely on that to figure out what your status data actually maps to. So we have our group here, and that's going to be the user ID. We didn't have to ask for a group by a user because the endpoint was actually a user endpoint. So it is just going to be there. We've got our data for our interval. And now we can see we've got the T agent routing status metric. So that's the time the agent spent in a routing status. And the qualifier is the specific routing status. So interacting in this case. And I can see that this is the amount of milliseconds that this user spent interacting. So I can see a breakdown of their routing status data. They were not responding. I can also see their T system presence. So in this case, available, for example, on queue. And so this is gonna source views like the agent status view, but you might have your own reporting. This is more like what you would do to try to get an idea of how much your agents are working for a given day, how they're spending their time. Are they on break too long? Things like that. So those are just 2 of the several aggregate endpoints. So again, explore those and see what all is out there because there is a lot there. And the data that you care about might be the data that I care about. So everyone has their own perspective of what they are looking for. So now let's move over to our third data perspective, and that's detail records. Think of this data as a ledger or a lifecycle style event stream over a period of time. It's time-stamped, it's birth to death, it's an audit log style record. Detailed data is available for conversations and for users. For user details, we can see all the status changes that an agent made during a time period. So let's take a look at that first. So now I'm going to be doing a post to the user details query endpoint. I'm going to supply an interval. In this case, I'm only doing a week. If you don't do additional filtering outside of the user, you're going to have to limit it to 1 week. If you do add additional filtering, you can expand it up to 31 days. And so I'm going to have my user filter. So in this case, I just care about one user, just so we can look at it. I'm going to have an order. So because it is detailed data, it's going to be ordering based on the timestamp. I also have paging. So detailed data has pages of data, and you're going to have to page through to get all of the data. But let's just take a look at what this looks like. So for this user detailed data, we get it back, we've got our user ID, and now we've got our primary presence data. So I can see for a system presence, what is the start and end time? So in this case, I've got this time that this agent was available. I can see when they started their available block and when they ended it. I can tell that after that they went offline, and I can walk through how their statuses looked through the day. I'm also going to have our routing status data. So I can see in this case that the agent was interacting, and I can see exactly how long they were interacting because I, again, have that start and end timestamps. Let's try another query, though. In this case, I'm going to apply some filters. So we can do a presence filter. So in this case, I only want records where the system presence is available, and I only want routing status data where the routing status was interacting. So in this case, we're going to look at our primary presence, and we're going to see there's a lot less data there. Instead, it's just my available records. And for routing status as well, just my interacting records, and everything else is going to be filtered out. We also have the ability to do aggregations. So a presence aggregation of type term frequency with the dimension system presence and size 1 would mean tell me the most used system presence. Similarly, I can do a routing status aggregation based on the routing status dimension and size 1. That's going to tell me the most used routing status. So if I look through, I get my data just the same, my detailed data, but now I also have these aggregations, and I can see that my most used routing status was interacting, and the count was 942. And the most used system presence was available with a count of 44. So that's a little bit about the user data or user details data. But now we'll look at the conversation detail record, where we can look at everything that happened during the conversation. So our endpoint is now conversation details query. We're similarly going to have the same order. In this case, we're going to be ordering by conversation start. We're going to have our paging. And then we're going to have segment filters. So there's different types of filters. You can see more on the Dev Center, but segment filters and conversation filters are the primary. In this case, I'm saying I want to filter for voice data. And then I also have my interval. Again, you can do 31 days if you have some filters, but otherwise you have to do just 7 days. So here's what that looks like. You can see it's a lot of data. We've got our conversation ID, start and end times. We've got information about evaluations and divisions. Then we get into our participants. We can see all of our participants in the interaction. We can see their sessions. Within a session, we have different segments. So there's a ton of data here, and pretty much every conversation detail record is going to look a little bit different because every conversation is going to be a little bit unique. But you're going to have information like names, DNS, Annie, direction. If there are metrics during that time, you're going to have those as well. So you're going to know that there was an offered metric and a TACD metric in this one because the purpose is ACD, and this is my help desk queue. So that's a little bit about what that data looks like. Again, you're going to want to really look through that data yourself and just kind of, I apologize, and explore that data a little bit, because your data is going to be different than everyone else's. But we can add different filters in here. We could also say we want to look at the direction dimension. And we want to look at inbound data. This is going to tell me I want voice and inbound data. So now I'm going to be completely filtered to my inbound only interactions. And you could do the same with outbound, for example. So you can, if you only care about a certain type of data, you can apply more filters there. Let's do another run where we want to get all data where there was an outbound campaign. So in this case, we have an additional filter for the outbound campaign ID dimension existing. Everything else is the same. But now this is going to be only data that had a campaign. So we're going to see more details about, the media type is callback, the direction is outbound. We're going to have the callback username, the callback numbers, our campaign data. And this is really how it's going to look a lot different than the inbound data, is we're going to have more of this kind of stuff. Let's try just one more query, and that's doing a metric filter. So in this case, I'm doing my segment filters for voice and for a QID, but I'm also going to add a conversation filter with the metric type. And my metric is abandon, and I just care that it exists. So this is going to give me only interactions that abandoned. So I'm going to be able to go through and look at these interactions and try to get an understanding of why they abandoned. I'm going to be able to see at what point they abandoned, and learn a little bit more about what's going on there. If you want all of this data, but you're okay with an asynchronous approach that requires a bit of waiting, then the jobs endpoints are going to be perfect for you. And again, these are documented in the API docs, but I'll just briefly show you what that's going to look like. Your query is going to look very similar. You're going to be sending your same request in, but now we're doing a post to conversation details jobs instead of conversation details query. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me a job ID back. And then I'm going to be able to do a get on that job ID. And I'm going to see it's pending. And so you would occasionally query this, not too frequently to avoid rate limiting, but it's going to tell me when it's fulfilled. So, so because this is asynchronous, you're not going to know exactly how long it's going to take, but this is going to be a lot better for your batch processing. And hopefully this is going to get done while we're still talking, but I'll just keep trying it. So when this is fulfilled, then we're just going to append /results to this endpoint, and we're going to start getting our results. But now we're actually going to get 1,000 at a time. So the detail endpoints are limited to 100 items at a time. But if you can wait a bit for your results, you can use the job endpoints to page through 100 results at a time, which is going to be a little bit easier for you to process a lot of data. So again, I apologize. This didn't get finished in time. There may have just been a lot of other requests going on at the time. But when this does fulfill, which will probably be as soon as I'm done with this call, then we would just add results to the end. And when we send that, we're going to see that exact same conversation detail data. But this time, we're going to see it for 1,000 records instead of only 100. So actually, it looks like it did just complete. So let's try that out. So I'm going to do a get, and you can see it's a ton of data. So Postman is going to try to format it for me, but it's so much data because it's 1,000 interactions. So it's going to give you that exact same data, but with the luxury of not having to page several times. And that's also a little easier on the system when you can do an asynchronous approach and send in your request and kind of just wait around till you actually need it. It's also very important that as you use analytics APIs, you try to be a good citizen. And that means it's best to avoid regular querying, but rather to rely on our built-in support for live updating. And so you're going to want to take a look at notifications. So we can do notifications. You'll see use the notification service here, but you'll also see available topics in here. And how this is going to work is I can, for example, just go into the notification testing tool. And I can pick what notification I care about, and I can subscribe. So in this case, I subscribed to Q Observations, and I'm going to start seeing metrics come in. So this is our way to avoid having to pull. You're going to get data just constantly as it updates. So also explore those and use them whenever possible. So just briefly to wrap it up, if you are wanting to explore these endpoints, the API Analytics Query Builder and the Dev Center is going to be a great tool to do that. You can do different types of queries. You can add in all the filters you want, and you can execute them right there. So I really encourage you to explore the docs, try your hand at some of these queries on your own, and start building. I hope you learn some more about the data that you have. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Maisey, do you want, for the Q&A, do you want me to read the questions out loud and then would you mind answering them?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay, so one question that just came in the case of callbacks, how do we get estimated wait time and where do we see that on PureCloud?
Okay, so your estimated wait time is going to be actually a separate endpoint. It's not actually through the analytics data. It's through your predictions data. And I'm not 100% sure if it is publicly available yet. I know that they're working on some enhancements so that we can expose that in our UIs. But I can take that as an action item to look into if that is publicly available, and if so, send you out that information.
Okay, that would be great. So I'll work with you on that. So we have, let's see, another question. So if I want to pull a full day's data, tens of thousands of conversations, I can either do it in 5-minute intervals or set a page size. So how would one pull like thousands of conversations?
If you really want that much data, your best bet is going to be using the asynchronous jobs endpoint. I forgot to mention it on the call, but it is important to also note that that is it's a pipeline that builds every night, so you won't be able to get today's data. Usually have to go at least back to yesterday's data. But that's going to be your best way to, in a performant manner, get tens of thousands of interactions through the API. You can do querying, but if you're going 100 at a time, you're going to be going pretty deep into the table. It's going to get slower as it gets deeper into the table, and you're just going to be making a ton of requests. So both are an option, but the jobs endpoint is definitely the better citizen approach.
The jobs endpoint?
Yeah, the conversation details jobs endpoint.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Okay, yeah, that was, I think another one, Michelle was asking conversation detail, page size 25 means, what does page size 25 mean?
Okay.
That's the question.
Yep, so 25 for the page size means that when you make the request, you're gonna only get 25 interactions, and then you're gonna have to keep paging deep. So you can change that to page size of 100. That's your max for that, for the conversation details query endpoint. And then you'll only get a cursor value. That was another question if you do the jobs request. So that cursor will basically be what keeps your place so that you can go through the data.
Okay, and can you explain a little more about the upcoming bulk subscription channel?
Becky, is this one you can take?
Yeah, that's something that's still on our product roadmap that we're taking up as an enhancement later on this year. But essentially what that'll let you do is bulk subscribe to topics on behalf of more than one entity. So rather than, for instance, subscribing to the notification service to get a single user's presence update, you could either wildcard or enter more than one user ID, and that's going to help you be more efficient with using the notification service. So be on the lookout. We'll continue to share information on that product enhancement in our ideas portal, and I can send out the related idea out in the email that we're sending out after this webinar, as well as in the Dev Center. So stay tuned.
Thanks a lot, Becky. Okay, let's see. We haven't gotten any more questions in, so I'll just give it another minute here, talking real slow if there's any stragglers. Okay, that was the moment of silence there. So Maisey, thank you so much for going over the analytics with us. As we mentioned, we will be sending a follow-up email that includes the recording, answers, like follow-up answers. Oh, we got a question in. Just to finish what I was saying, follow-up answers. We'll send you an email that has all of the resources that we mentioned during this call. The last question we just received, what is the minimum increment time that we can pull metrics?
Can you clarify, Jimmy, if you mean polling, like querying multiple times, or like what's the smallest bucket of time I can ask for?
That's a good question.
I could answer both. So you can query data. Okay, so he was looking for the smallest bucket of time that he could ask for. You could do a minute. You could, in theory, do a granularity even smaller than a minute. I'd argue that is probably not as useful. Generally, we stick to our intervals, which are usually 30 or 15 minutes, but you can go lower to whatever you want. So you can just use the granularity format of like PT, 30M, things like that, so that you can ask for whatever granularity you want.
That's a good question. Another question, looking at the JSON request example code in the API documentation, do we document what every specific variable would require? Or do we have filled in example requests somewhere? I'm not
following that.
I'm not sure. Bert, would you mind clarifying for us a little bit? So Jimmy actually had a follow-up question too. Can you just, Bert, we're gonna get back to you once we get some more clarity on that question. But for Jimmy, can you describe the query method?
Okay, so assuming you're talking about your previous question, you would, if you were looking at like the conversation aggregates query, you would be doing a post to that endpoint, and you would just pick whatever interval of time you want. So that interval, if you want just a short snapshot of like 1 minute or whatever your minimum amount you're looking for is, you can pick that interval, or you can widen your interval a little bit and then supply a granularity that represents what you want it to be bucketed in. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
And we had another question from Connor. Does the notification service make calls in the other direction? So from Genesys to the customer's endpoint based on a subscription?
I'm not 100% sure I'm following that one, but any service that subscribes to the notification service would be getting the same updates, but that should be all that will happen. I don't think there's not any calls or anything that the notification service will do. They'll just give you the outputted notifications.
Okay. We have someone that's new to REST API. Can you please show any of the HTTP requests for a query endpoint?
Yeah, so I've written up something that is going to show how you, what endpoint you would hit, if what action you would do post get, for example, with all of the example queries that I've come up with.
Let's see. And then you might want to read this from Bert. He's clarifying.
Okay, so sorry, I'm still trying to find exactly where you're seeing something about getting a variable.
Maisey, is it okay? Maybe we could follow up with Bert.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Bert, we can reach out to you.
Yeah, Bert, is it okay if we reach out to you about this? I think we're just having trouble understanding the complete question, but we can follow up with you, Bert. There was one more question that came in. The event body class, which needs to be created in Java, would accept only the defined JSON payload mentioned in the document. Or can we create any custom JSON payload if we're trying to do custom stats?
I'm not sure what this one is referring to specifically. Sorry.
Okay. Let's see. Becky, are you able to answer?
Yeah, this is a question that I would recommend raising in the developer forum so that we can take the time to thoroughly understand your question and your use case and provide adequate advice.
Okay. Yeah, the developer forum is a really that would give us an opportunity to elaborate a little bit further. Let's see. So we should probably follow. Okay, I'm making note of these questions to follow up on them if we can't.
And I think I did just find at least what Bert was asking about. There is like a JSON example of what the output is going to look like. And we don't actually show what any of those actual values should be. We say like ID and then it's empty string. There isn't a place that has really filled in examples of that, unfortunately.
Okay. Hopefully Bert was still with us to get that answer. And for the event body class question, we will have to follow up on that. Or again, the developer forum is a good option. But I think we should probably wrap it up because we are just about at the end of the hour. Thank you guys so much for coming. Really appreciate your time. We hope that you found this helpful. Maisey, again, thanks for taking the time to teach us about the analytics API. Hope you guys have a beautiful weekend. And Maisey, do you have any closing words?
No, I just wanted to thank you all for joining and thank you all for being understanding of the circumstances. And I am looking forward to hearing what all you guys are going to be doing with the Analytics API. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks. Have a great day.